A good awareness of the full scope of either the NG1, elements 1 to 4, or the NGC1, elements 1 to 5. So that's why, despite us doing it in sort of Zoom and things like that, the end assessment is going to still expect us to know a little bit about all of those elements. It's a little bit different because you will have access to your notes and the internet and books and things like that, which people doing the traditional exam wouldn't. But, you know, it's still important that we've got that awareness, because at the end of the day, you're trying to get a qualification which can assist you in the workplace. So that's why it's important for us to, you know, make sure that we cover everything adequately. Okay. So as I say, we're going to beaver our way through. So from an information point of view, for whether you're on the NG1 or the NGC1, we're going to be doing some of element 3. Getting that one finished, and then we're going to be moving on to part of element 4. Okay, so we're going to, as I say, odds and sods, emergency procedures. Every organisation must have some emergency procedures. The management of health and safety at work regs requires us to have some emergency procedures, but even before that, we had requirements as a minimum to have arrangements for fire safety. So our learning point for emergency procedures, we're going to look at what typical emergency procedures you might have, including training and testing of them, and what types of things we need to make sure are in those plans to make sure they're working. And this particular element also, we're going to have a look at the minimum standards for first aid. Okay, so it's emergency procedures and first aid. And as you'll see, you know, these are not deep and meaningful. These are quite small topics, and they're not small topics because I'm making them small. They're small because they're just a small element of the syllabus. So thinking about your organisation, because everyone's a little bit different, I've mentioned fire, but in your organisations, what other emergencies might you need to plan for? What other emergencies have you got perhaps a procedure for? Procedure, yeah. So what the management of health and safety at work regs do, because originally we had fire legislation that said you must have arrangements for dealing with a fire. Along came the management regs in 1992. So Health and Safety Executive, HSG 268, just for information, it's a guidance note. So that's another bit of revision. Remember, we've got acts of Parliament, sets of regulations. We've then got approved codes of practice, which are not the law, but they show you how to comply. And then below that, we've got guidance notes, and the guidance notes are always HSG, Health and Safety Guidance Note. This is number 268. So it's not the law, but it's all good stuff to help you comply. So they publish an emergency planning, sort of a guidance note, which we'll sort of have a look at. So it requires us to, the sort of things that it wants us to do, as I've mentioned. Right, what might happen on our site? What emergencies might we need to deal with? If we do have an emergency, how are we going to raise the alarm? Now, obviously, you've probably, if you've got a site with a building, you're going to have a fire alarm. But if you've got a fire alarm, that's fine for fire. But what do you do when there is a gas leak? What do you do if it's a chemical spill? So it may not always be actually using a Claxton or a built-in alarm system. Some of that raising the alarm might be by a person saying something. But again, the higher the risk, the more sophisticated our system might need to be. So in a small scale workplace, you know, it may be that someone shouts fire. That is acceptable if it was a very small workplace. But if you've got lots of different hazards or risks, and you see sometimes you might actually have different alarms that talk about or show you that you've got different emergencies. we have plan, do, check and act. So where have we seen that before? Where does plan, do, check and act come from? What is it? Where would you see that?
In the risk assessment?
Maybe not the risk assessment. It might lead you to do a risk assessment. But what
Inspections?
Sorry?
Inspection?
Inspections could be part of the checking. Okay, so no problem. So plan, do, check, act. It's part of health and safety management system. So HSG 65, which is a typical health and safety management system, says plan. So think about what might happen. Do, put your procedures in place. Check to make sure they're working. And act would be, if something's not working, putting in those changes. So HSG 65 is a health and safety management system. And as this guidance note is written by the HSE, HSG 268 is reminding us, if you want if you're doing emergency planning, you still need to think about planning, getting your procedures in place, which is doing, checking they actually work by your drills and practices, and act would be looking at scope for improvement. Okay, so it's just sort of thinking of the whole thing rather than have the procedure about doing and then, right, we've done that, what do we need to do now? So in our emergency plan, what do people need to do? Part of our emergency plan is, right, if this happens, who do you want to do what? So it might start with the most senior person on site, what they need to do, and it might then go down to the individual people, what action do they need to take? And it may even include people with specialist roles, such as first aiders. You might have like emergency responders or people that you use to clear up chemical spills. Even the person who's on the gate for security, stopping everybody else coming into the building if there's an emergency that's been activated. So what do people need to do? And that's when, if we lay that down, we can then use that as a basis to communicate, right, if you're this person, this is what you need to do. So it's about nominating our competent people to take control. So if you've got a site that's that's got various shifts, and you've got various departments, in your plan, you need to think about who's got overall control. So equally, someone has got to take control. And what you don't want to do is name a person, because what if that person is not there? So if you do name a person, there's got to be a deputy. It's better to maybe make it a job role, and then whoever happens to be in that job role at that particular time, they are the nominated person to take control. But you don't just nominate them. So when you're at the meeting and you need a person, don't just nominate the one who's not in the room and then not tell them about it. So if you nominate them, you've got to then make sure that they're trained, informed, and they know what their role is, what they need to do. So we've got our competent people and then our other key people. So as I say, that could be supervisors, it could be engineering who isolate things, it could be your first aiders, it could be your security guard, it could be the person on reception. Who are these other key people who need to take action? Who are they and what do you actually want them to do? So that will lead then, right, we've got who and what they need to do. That's going to lead to what the essential actions are. So in a large scale, if we've got an emergency, it might include shutting down the plant, it might include isolating pumps or isolating chemical storage, these types of things, to make sure that those actually, happen. Once we've got a plan, part of our doing is then training employees. So if this happens, they know what to do. And it's all very well training employees, but the very nature of emergencies is they don't happen very often. So it's not just about, well, we trained people on the induction course and then we told them about the emergency procedures. Particularly with emergency planning, it's training, refresher, carrying out drills and practices so that if something happens, people are familiar with what's expected of them and what they need to do. And we've had lots of quite serious accidents in the past where people haven't been aware of the emergency plans, and then people have actually done the wrong thing rather than the right thing, and then actually, made it worse. So we can train our employees, they're key for our emergency procedures. Then we need to think about information for others. So that could be you've got visitors, it could be maybe you've got contractors working on your site, but it may even be for the neighbours. it's all very well you evacuating your plant because you've had an ammonia leak, but what about the neighbouring housing estate who's now got this ammonia wafting over to them? So in some cases, particularly in high-risk situations, we have to think about notifying people off-site as well as on-site. And some large-scale chemical installations, they even have an automated system where local people's telephone numbers and emails are actually, kept. So as soon as something happens, they actually send out an alert to let those people know, because they may be at greater risk. Equally, thinking about your site and who you've got on site, if you've got vulnerable workers, so that could be our usual runners and riders, you might have young people, pregnant ladies or nursing mothers, you might have someone with a disability, someone with an ill health condition, that type of thing. And if you're really lucky, one that's all of those. But it's making sure that in our emergency situation, we don't put everything in place so everyone else can evacuate and leave the site, but the person with the mobility problem is left, on their own. So it's making sure we consider that. Do they need to have a specific buddy who goes to make sure that they're, evacuated? Does it mean that we need to take them to a place of safety so they stay there until they can be more formally, evacuated? So it's just making sure that we take that into account. Equally, we've had our emergency, we've dealt with it, etc. It's then also making sure that our procedure and people are aware that you don't start work until after the emergency is resolved. I'm sure you might even have been involved in a fire drill. Sometimes we have a fire drill, everybody goes out, and then for some unknown reason, people just start wafting back and going back into the workplace even before they've been told to. So it is important, particularly in high risk situations, that people know, right, if the emergency plan has been activated, we're not, no one can resume work until after, the emergency. And that's where having a competent person to take control and emergency wardens or links to make sure that people don't go back in and don't start up machinery and all of these sorts of things. So emergency planning, we hope that we're never going to use it, but we need, it's having that plan B. If something goes wrong, what we're going to need to do, and making sure that people are trained to do it. Okay, so right, okay, so we've just done a couple of questions there. Just going to put, as I say, what I've done, I've made a note of your answers. I will type those up and then put them into like a slide so that when you see the slides, there'll be an answer as well. So here's one I prepared earlier, this is for the second one. So just some examples, and I think nearly everything that we've just mentioned there for that third question, you've come out with anyway. So we've got the location of the site and site plans and the location of those site plans. So some sites will actually have a grab box outside the building, so you can grab your emergency procedures even if you can't get into the building. Arrangements for access to the site, and that included things like your keys, as you said, who our neighbours are and who we might need to contact, our water courses, have we got any sensitive areas? So again, their drainage plan, because it may be, yes, we've dealt with the immediate emergency on our site, but we don't want to be then actually, causing problems off-site with water or chemicals and things like that. So what operations are actually undertaken on site? What do we do? Do we need any specific emergency equipment? That might be emergency showers. It could be a gas suppression system. It could even be, okay, so we've got communication on site and media, but also, as I mentioned, communication off-site, depending on where you are and what might happen. Contact numbers, and again, that could be on-site. So sometimes in your own emergency plans, you might have senior manager numbers and things like that. as well as the numbers for emergency services, Environment Agency, other authorities, the utility companies, etc. Roles and responsibilities, people talked about who's the competent person, that type of thing. Emergency services, how we contact them, and who's responsible for updating our plans and procedures, and briefing and training arrangements. So there's just a few there. That's not all of the ones that you mentioned. And I wasn't actually answering your question, but just putting down some typical things. But if you were looking at emergency procedures and plans, obviously the main thing is it relates to the emergencies that are relevant to your particular site, and it's also important that it is updated. So having, you might do a drill to make sure that people know what to do and when to do it, but you might do also what's called a desktop exercise, where they actually check things like the phone numbers and the contacts and that type of thing to make sure that they're valid as well. So we hope we're never going to need to use it, but it's making sure it's there just in case. Okay, so we've had a look at emergency procedures.